Okay, welcome back to members of 121 Community Church in Grapevine, Texas, and our ongoing study in the new perspective on Paul through the Evangelical lens in James Dunn's book, The Theology of Paul the Apostle. We have finished the introduction, so now we're going to take a look at pages 23 to 33 and get started with the first stages of Paul's theology. Let's go to block 1, and we're going to take a look at prioritizing the book of Romans as the best document for a theology of Paul. A dynamic historical beginning. Paul's theology unfolds as historical dialogue, which calls for our participation, where we enter in by posing questions, and those questions are supreme questions of our reality. And then Dunn says there's a threefold flux that imprints Paul's theology, and I agree with him here. We must locate the self within the dynamic aspect of Paul's own life, and that flow includes the Damascus Road theophany, where he was confronted by the light of the Father, knocked to the ground. Then he heard the voice of Christ, and then his heart was filled with the conviction of the Spirit. It was a triune theophany on the road to Damascus. And then the Jerusalem consultations. After his conversion, he interviewed Simon Peter, and he interviewed James the Just. And I also think that along with that, I'm pretty sure that he also looked at the Q document, the sayings document that was being circulated by the early church. I would add that to the Jerusalem consultations. And then Dunn says the third item is the incident at Syria, Antioch. So it's a Damascus Road theophany, Jerusalem consultations, and the incident at Antioch. And then he says, and of course, you have to consider the news concerning Galatia, his earliest endeavor of mission work. But the letter to the Romans does seem to transcend this historic dynamic flux. In Romans, Paul is thinking in a relatively fixed way. Paul's letter to the Romans was written to a church Paul had not founded. It was at the end of his missionary work. See Romans 15, 18 through 24. And therefore it was written after he'd done all that missionary work. It was a letter of careful reflection and very careful systematic composition, where he, in a very mature way, defended the gospel. And I agree with all of that Dunn is telling us here. I think that's exactly the truth. That's exactly what did happen. Let's go on block 2 and take a look at Paul's axiomatic belief in God. Paul's theology begins here. Belief in God is his fundamental presupposition to all of his theology. He uses the concept of theos, for God, 548 times in his letters. He's an apostle called through God's will, through God the Father, says Galatians 1:1. God the Father. In Romans itself, it is filled with genitive case phrases. Paul talks of the gospel of God, the Son of God, the beloved of God, the will of God, the power of God, the doxa glory of God, the aletheia truth of God, the dikaiosune righteousness of God, and the dikaiosune righteousness of God of God is the theme of the letter to the Romans. But here's the key. For Dunn, he says Paul's convictions about God are all axiomatic. What does that mean? It means if they are axiomatic, they don't need to be proven. They are self-evident, self-revelatory beliefs. Self-evident, self-revelatory presuppositions. And I agree with that concerning Paul's belief in God. It is axiomatic. There's no need for further explication. So block 2, note 3, Paul's axiomatic belief in God. Since no further explication was necessary, Paul begins his theological analysis with the human condition. Speech about God was a shared speech and a shared belief with the very first congregations. So here we reach our first need to plot the historical context, says Dunn. And that historical context is going to be Jewish and is going to concern Paul's own religious Jewish tradition. So we have to take a serious look at first century Judaism and the axiomatic belief in God that did not need a list of proofs, did not need explication. It was a belief as axiomatic truth, self-evident, self-revelatory truth. And I share that conviction. Obviously I have adopted Paul's theology for my own life. I really prefer Paul's theology. And I feel the same way about belief in God. You don't prove belief in God. You don't set up a list of rational proofs for the existence of God, because number one, God is beyond concept. God is beyond secular, rational description. God is beyond secular, rational explication and secular, rational logic. You don't explain the eternal logos with secular logic. It's an impossibility. And so my own belief follows this exact same line of truth being presented by Dunn here, that belief in God is axiomatic. Belief in God must be an axiomatic truth. It is an axiom of truth that should never be given a list of proofs. You don't rationally prove the existence of God. If someone says, why do you believe in God? Why do you believe in God? You've got all these issues that you face, and it looks like you have a life that's a struggle and a difficult life. How can you possibly believe in God? And the only way that I could genuinely answer somebody on that is to somehow be able to let them examine my existential experiences. And that is impossible to do, but somehow, since God's existence has been existentially verified to me over the entire course of my life, but how can I convey that to somebody? How can I convey my existential experience to another human being? How can they step into my shoes and live and relive my existential experiences? Because my belief in God is axiomatic. My belief in God is an axiomatic truth, and it is existentially verified through existential theophany experiences. And, we look at this description from Dunn about, in block 1 there, that the Damascus Road theophany has a lot to do with Paul's belief in God. That triune theophany event that occurred on Damascus Road drove him into Arabia for 3 years of spiritual retreat. Then it drove him to Jerusalem for interviews with Simon Peter and James the Just. And then he returned to Tarsus for additional postgraduate study. And then he returned back to Jerusalem in AD 50 or 51 for the Jerusalem Council. But Paul went through a very extensive series of deeply existential, significant events that all began with the Damascus Road theophany. It all began with that Damascus Road theophany. A theophany is an encounter, a visionary encounter with the triune divine Godhead, and that occurred for Paul on the road to Damascus. And so in block 1 there, I agree with Dunn that one dynamic aspect of Paul's own life that truly influenced his belief in God was the Damascus Road theophany. It also was extremely important for creating the conviction in his heart that his theology would always be Christocentric theology, Christ-centered theology. And from that point on, it always was Christ-centered theology, always Christocentric. So we learn in block 2 here that Paul begins his theological analysis with the human condition. And he does begin by, Dunn says, by turning to the Jewish religious tradition. Remember, Paul is of the tribe of Benjamin, a Pharisee of Pharisees. He was an excellent student of Gamaliel. He was recommended to the Sanhedrin because he was a superior student under the teaching of Gamaliel, and Gamaliel was recommending him to the Sanhedrin, but then the Lord had other plans for him and interrupted that career in the Jewish temple with a theophany on the road to Damascus. Let's go to block 3. God as one. The oneness of God was Paul's fundamental belief. Deuteronomy 6:4. It was Paul's theological starting point. For Paul, God was also invisible, or more precisely, God was unimageable. See Exodus 20, verse 4. There was the Jewish, first century Judaism did not allow any images of God to be made. God was unimageable. God as uncreated and immutable. God's form transcends all of our powers of description. And then 1 Corinthians 8:4, Paul says, there is no God except one. And then in Ephesians 4:6, Paul confessed the Shema. And again in Galatians, his first letter, but God is one. Paul's fundamental belief as a first century Judaic Pharisee was the belief, the starting point, in God as one. An axiomatic belief in God and an axiomatic belief in God as one, and through Christ, an axiomatic belief in God as Father. So it's a very, very powerful beginning here, but it really does come down to situating Paul's theology in that triune dynamic aspect of his own life in Block 1. Go to Block 1, Note 2, the threefold flux that imprinted Paul's theology. We must locate the self within the dynamic aspect of Paul's own life, a dynamic aspect that included the Damascus Road theophany, the Jerusalem interviews with Simon Peter and James the Just. He interviewed Simon Peter, he interviewed James the Just, and then add to that, it's not written down, but add to that, he read and researched the Q document, the sayings document that included the sayings of Christ that was being circulated through the early congregations. And then we have the incident at Antioch, says Dunn. All three of those deeply, deeply shaped Paul's theology. And I would add one in between Damascus Road theophany and Jerusalem consultations, Arabia retreat. So, but I'm giving you the way I've got it written down. This is the way that Dunn wanted to list it, but I would add to it. My list would be Damascus Road theophany, Arabia retreat, Jerusalem consultations, incident at Antioch, and then Jerusalem council. I would have, I guess, two more added in there if I did it. But that's his triad. His triad is Damascus Road theophany, Jerusalem consultations, and incident at Antioch as the threefold event that dynamically imprinted Paul's theology through his entire mission career. And I agree with that entirely. In fact, I add the Arabia retreat and the Jerusalem council to it. But that's the key, because that really is what, from the very beginning, that deeply imprints Paul's heart, that deeply imprints Paul's mind, his soul. And it does, initially, that theophany drove him into Arabia for years of spiritual retreat and meditation and trying to come to terms with what happened to him in that event of tremendous transcendence on the road to Damascus. Well, the road to Damascus, the theophany, and then right after that, the baptism in Damascus. Then he had to come to terms with that, and he was, I think he was driven into Arabia. It was less of a choice and more of a being spiritually driven into the wilderness of Arabia for retreat. And then after that, he felt compelled to interview Simon Peter, and he felt very compelled to interview James the Just in Jerusalem. And I believe, he was a brilliant student. I think he would probably research the Q document, the sayings document of Christ, sayings that was circulating in the early church. And then after that, He went back to Tarsus for additional education, and then ultimately landed back at the very first ecumenical council, the Jerusalem Council of AD 51. But those events deeply imprinted Paul's life. I mean, extremely deeply imprinted his soul, deeply imprinted his life forever. I mean, he went from being a persecutor of the church to becoming a dedicated apostle of Christ who fought for the